He's an award-winning Connecticut author and Vietnam veteran whose books tell the stories of veterans, caregivers, and their families. Now Ron Farina has set his sights on telling the stories of those who've helped the US military in Afghanistan. Plus, we take a look at other stories making the headlines from around the region. This is Connecticut East This Week. Hello, I'm Brian Scott Smith. Ron Farina is a Vietnam veteran turned author, and we've previously spoken to him on Connecticut East This Week about his trilogy of books all about sacrifice, involving other military veterans, their families, and caregivers. Now the award-winning Farina has turned his attention to his new book, which looks at the life of an Afghanistan interpreter, just one of 50,000 who served with the US military during the 2-decade-long conflict in Afghanistan. Ron, welcome back to Connecticut East. I believe this is actually now the third time you've been on the podcast, because the first time we introduced you, the second time you were our Christmas 2024 episode, talking about sacrifice, and we're going to be talking about that again. Now you're back again, and you're going to be talking about a new book. We're not going to give that all away straight away, but how are you?
I'm well, and yourself?
Very good. So thank you for coming back on to talk.
Thank you for having me.
Just remind us very quickly of those three books, because it ended with obviously Sacrifice, which we'll be talking again about in just a moment.
Yes, and Sacrifice is really the namesake of the trilogy. The last book is actually called Sacrifice, the final chapter. But that all began really in the summer of 2018. I was actually still completing my MFA, and I began writing about veterans who had fought America's wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. That storytelling eventually filled the pages of 3 books. In the first one, I wrote about caregivers who take the responsibility for caring for veterans returning home with catastrophic combat injuries. And these were men and women mangled in IED attacks and riddled by bullets during firefights. That was the first one. The second, I chronicled the stories of 9 American women soldiers, each one wounded while serving in Iraq or Afghanistan, some of them in both theaters. But each one of those stories is really representative of the thousands of women who served side by side with their male counterparts. And in the final book, in Sacrifice, the final chapter, I came full circle and told the stories of the families of fallen soldiers, stories that show readers everywhere, I think, what it means for a family, mother, father, brother, sister, husband, wife, to lose a loved one in war, and how that one death actually touches so many people. That's the trilogy.
We should also put into context as well for anybody listening, you are yourself a Vietnam War veteran. You have served this country, and that is your background. So you do come at this with a knowledge, obviously, of the US military. Earlier this year as well, a couple of big things that happened this year. Because of those 3 books, you got recognized by the state of Connecticut and were inducted into the Connecticut Veterans Hall of Fame, I believe, in January of this year, along with other very well-deserving members of the military. How did you find out about that, and how did it make you feel?
One of the Gold Star mothers, who I had written about in Sacrifice, the final chapter, nominated me for that particular award. And I was kind of out of sight, out of mind. I wasn't really even thinking about it. When someone nominates you, it really takes both of you to put together the package. The package is massive. And what the state asks is your history from boot camp until your most recent breakfast. Seriously. So Helen and I worked together to put that package. She submitted it, and it wasn't on my mind, and I don't believe it was on hers. And then all of a sudden you get a letter, and refreshing that it's actually a letter by post, not an email. And you've been selected as a Connecticut Veterans Hall of Fame member. So it was a surprise that I was selected, not a surprise that I had been nominated, because I had to be involved in the process. And I'm overwhelmed with an honor like that. There's so many veterans who are probably more deserving, who haven't been nominated that maybe should be. So hopefully we can get them recognition as well.
It must have been an emotional day because you all attend an event here in the state of Connecticut. Just give us a sense of how you were feeling on the day.
What's the overused word? Surreal? I think that probably aptly describes it. You're marched down the aisle by full military escort of the branch of service that you served in. So I'm surrounded by current active duty Marines in full dress blues. I had eschewed ever wearing the dress blues myself. I thought maybe it was a little much. But the whole military atmosphere of all of it really begins to pull at your memory and honestly send shivers down your spine that here I am, an aging veteran, closing in on 60 years since I left Vietnam, suddenly thrust back into those memories. It's an emotional day for sure.
Just taking a quick little sidestep that's still relevant to our conversation. Actually, this year, of course, is 50 years of the end of the Vietnam War. Does that also bring back memories as well? Because there's been quite a lot of, media attention to that, although obviously the US stepped out a few years before. But does that bring back memories?
It does. There were several of us that were all part of what was called a crash fire aviation rescue team. And we were all in the 1st Marine Air Wing. And it seemed like, for me, I was always one step ahead of disaster or one step behind disaster. There were 3 of us that had originally been stationed at a combat air base called Marble Mountain. And we all were sent further north, each one of us to different stations. I went to a place called Phu Bai, which was right outside, 8 miles outside of Hue. And it had been the old French airport that had serviced the capital city and been turned into a Marine combat air base. Phil Curran went up to Khe Sanh, one of the worst places you could possibly be. And Al Rose went to Dong Ha. Phil and Al were killed. And when you start shaking that tree again, those deaths fall out and you begin to remember how sad you are that they were lost, how lucky you are that you came back unscathed, untouched, where other men were killed and wounded all around you by whatever power there is. I was unscratched.
Another big piece of news that you received earlier this year, you were nominated by the Independent Book Publishing Professionals Group as one of the best indie books of 2025. It was For Sacrifice, the final chapter, the last in the trilogy. Again, talk to us about that. It's a big deal. And again, we consider the book industry a little bit fragmented these days. It's not quite the same as it used to be. The indie book thing is a big deal. So talk to us about that and what that meant to you as well.
I've been very reluctant to submit to any book awards for a few reasons. One, and I think probably the most prevalent reason for my reluctance was I'm writing about individuals who've gone through terrible loss. And it seemed to me that attempting to win an award was almost, maybe I shouldn't have been doing, that I felt that it really was undeserving of me to seek an award based on their sorrow. So I had just really avoided doing any of that. Because I guess the simplest way is I felt like maybe I'm exploiting them for my own benefit, and I didn't want to. But my original writing mentor said, no, don't look at it that way. Look at it as if the book does win an award, they'll even get more attention. So I submitted it, and I was shocked. I really was shocked that it won a place in Indie, because it's thousands. That's thousands of submissions from all over the world. So to have that book elected as one of the best military nonfiction books of 2025 was really quite an honor.
So your latest book that you actually have written is called Inshallah, If God Wills It, and it's an incredible real-life story of an Afghan combat interpreter. Tell us how and why that came about.
As I told the stories of families of fallen soldiers in Sacrifice the Final Chapter, I became aware of a combat interpreter who had been standing basically shoulder to shoulder with Captain Andrew Pedersen Deal, who had been killed. And I learned that this particular Afghan interpreter had performed heroically that particular day. He had been wounded. He was shot through the leg and the bullet passed through and he had shrapnel in his chest. There were other interpreters on the base. They were all incapacitated by wounds. And Abdul knew that someone needed to remain there and interpret between the friendly Afghan forces and American special forces. So he refused to be medevaced out until everything was finished and over and the base was secure. So it's hours later, wounded, bleeding, tourniquets stemming the blood flow, that he allowed himself to be medevaced out and tended to. When I learned of that, there is a story there that needs to be told, that I don't believe enough Americans understood what interpreters were doing for American military forces. And this story will be representative of the thousands of men and women interpreters who served side by side with the American military. So I did contact Abdul, and he agreed to tell the story and allow his story to be published without using any last names to protect him, because telling his story is not without risk. The Taliban actually have reached into the United States and will hunt interpreters living here in the United States if they can find them.
And we should just make it clear for the people that are listening that Abdul and his family have managed to move here to the United States under the special immigration visas.
Yes, Abdul, his wife, his children, and Abdul, after he got here, got two of his brothers out, but his father, two brothers, and his sister still live in Afghanistan. So we've got to be cautious about not exposing his last name or some details in the book that we actually won't put in the book, because that would lead them directly to Abdul's family.
A little bit more, obviously, about these brave men and women who acted as interpreters for American forces in Afghanistan. I understand it that over the period of time that the US was in Afghanistan, somewhere in the region of 70,000 Afghanis assisted American and other forces, as you say, with interpretation and other like resources. So it's a huge amount of people assisting that effort. Talk to us a little bit more about the book, because as we said, it is a real life story. The other interesting thing to mention as well is I was at the Sacrifice book launch, which was held in October of 2024. And Abdul was there and was recognized by US Senator Richard Blumenthal for obviously the services rendered to the United States. Talk to us a little bit more about your conversations that you've had with Abdul to bring his story to life.
Yes. And I was so happy to invite him to the book launch last October and to have the senator present him with your work. The senator's office was also very involved in his escape from Afghanistan, which is really harrowing part of the book. It was wonderful to bring him to that book launch and have Blumenthal give an award for his service. And as Blumenthal said in that meeting, what he did, most Americans would have gotten a bronze, maybe even a silver star for it. He got nothing. He got nothing. Pat on the back, oh, good job. At least we were able to recognize him. But his story is so unique. This is, whose story begins over 30 years ago, born into probably one of the most unique childhoods in modern day. He lived a simple life in a remote village along Panjshir Valley in northern Afghanistan. It's an iconic area. And this is a village that's 400 years old and almost unchanged in 400 years. No running water, no electricity, no outside communication of any sort with the outside world as we know it. No, meaning no phones, no internet, none of that. And what fascinates me is that these villagers, they partnered with nature, they communed with their God, Allah, and they lived peaceably, interdependent with nature, their God, with one another. And I think when you look at that life, it's closer to how the world was meant to be in its original intent. And was there poverty in Mata? Absolutely. Most of the villagers poor. I would say in the economic sense, yeah, that would be undeniable. But life in that village in its simplicity possessed a beauty and just a richness that no life in the modern world could ever provide. What fascinates me is that a young boy from this village, devoted to Islam, devoted to becoming a devout Muslim, could leave that village and become a heroic combat interpreter during America's 20-year war in Afghanistan. It just seems so improbable, but it happened. And that's his story, how all of that, and from a child in a 400-year-old remote village without really any knowledge of the modern world, to a combat interpreter who's helping save lives, to a man who escaped to America and lives in a modern world that I knew nothing about.
I think I read somewhere as I was doing the research for this interview that when you decided to do this book and speak and interview, Abdul, you said it really broke down your own preconceived or misinformed ideas about Islam and Muslims, and that you hope that clearly the book will do the same for the reader.
I really do. And the publisher that's picked it up believes that in some way it will accomplish that. But what I learned is, I think what we all know about most religions, if they're practiced in their true intent and in their original form, is that they're not extremists. They're people that want to live a life that is devoted to doing good. What I learned just destroyed all the everyday perceptions of Islam. Women in the village didn't wear headscarves or burqas. They attended school. They were considered in many ways equal, but different, of course, to the men. Yeah, Islam in its truth is really a very beautiful religion. And what I also learned is how so much of it, how Christianity is woven through so much of the Islamic religion. It was really eye-opening, and I hope the book will do the same thing for others.
Sounds like a deep personal book, not only for Abdul, but also for you, the writer, as well. It is going to be coming out, I believe, possibly next year, but there's some big news as well, because it's actually being taken up by a very large publisher. Talk to us about that.
Yes, I've been certainly fortunate to work with good publishers, micro publishers. The micro publishers have difficulty getting books into the hands of the big book sellers. So larger publishers, they have the relationship with the big booksellers. So this book, I was really focused on making sure that I could get this book into the hands of larger publishers. And Casemate came back and said, "We're interested. Send us the first 3 chapters." Sent off the first 3 chapters, and it's like they go into a black hole. You don't hear for months. And then they came back and said, not only are we interested in the story and find it fascinating, but we do want to publish it. And that, I mean, for every author, that's the pinnacle to have a major book publisher think highly enough of your work to want to publish it.
So when do you hope for that to actually get published?
The manuscript will go to edit right after the first of the year. And then the process after that is anywhere from 3 to 6 months. We're aiming for about this time in 2026.
Ron, we wish you continued success and congratulations, obviously, on striking that deal with the publisher. All of the books are incredible. And of course, we'll look forward to seeing that one coming out next year. Continued success in the meantime with everything that you do. And of course, if people want to read the trilogy, that is available via Amazon and most good bookstores, I believe, here in the US. But in the meantime, keep up the good work, keep the writing, and thanks for coming back on Connecticut East and giving us an update on what's happening with you and, of course, your writing.
As always, thanks for having me, Brian.
Farina's new book, Inshallah, If God Wills It, will be available in 2026. And in the meantime, if you haven't read his Sacrifice trilogy of books, again, you can find them under his author name, Ron Farina, on Amazon and at most good bookstores.
You said you'd never buy your kid candy from the checkout aisle. Or forget extra diapers. You'd never lick your thumb to clean their face. Never, ever become a minivan mom. So when you say you'd never leave your child in a hot car, no, it can happen. Cars get hot fast, and kids can be at risk in temperatures as low as 60 degrees Fahrenheit. Never happens. Before you leave the car, always stop, look, lock. Brought to you by NHTSA and the Ad Council.
Time now for a look at other stories making the headlines this week. Governor Lamont signed into law Public Act 25167, implementing recommendations of the Bipartisan Drug Task Force in the state. Among its several sections are increases in transparency on prescription drug rebates and how they are used to reduce cost sharing in health plans, as well as giving patients the right to receive credit for low-cost, out-of-pocket and out-of-network prescription drug expenses towards health plan deductibles. It also authorizes a feasibility study on the possible importation of affordable drugs from Canada. Lamont said he knows healthcare spending is a big issue.
I can tell you that pharmaceutical costs and cost of prescription drugs used to be 10% of our healthcare spend. Today is 20% of our healthcare spend. You say, well, okay, well, that's okay because it's keeping people out of the hospital. No, we're doing a lot of both right now. This bill does make a difference. There's a real imbalance out there between the PBMs and the big guys and the independent pharmacists and each and every one of you, the consumers. And we're trying to get you a little more, power behind this negotiation. ArrayRx is pretty good. We do this alongside 4 other states. We get some group purchasing in there, and that's able to save you on some drugs anywhere from 18 to 80%. Makes a difference going forward.
However, the possibility of cheaper drugs from Canada may not be possible. The state of Florida was authorized by the FDA in 2024 to import cheaper drugs from Canada, but to date has not established a launch date for that program. Also, a statement from Health Canada, who oversees Canada's drug program, said they will not be selling drugs to countries outside of Canada if that impacts the availability of drugs for Canadian citizens. The town of Nantucket in Massachusetts held a press conference recently, just 2 weeks after settling a nation-first agreement with GE Vernova, manufacturers of wind turbine blades, for $10.5 million after one of their blades shattered into thousands of pieces, polluting local waters and beaches off the island last summer. The latest situation in the ongoing offshore wind saga is to try and get the actual wind developer of Vineyard Wind, Avangrid Renewables, and its partners to comply with a community benefit agreement that was drawn up and agreed to by all parties. Brooke Moore is the former chair of the Town of Nantucket Select Board and says that Vineyard Wind is not holding up to their end of the 2020 agreement in 3 major ways.
First, by refusing to timely and fully communicate critical details about their massive industrial project just off our coast, which endangers the public and undermines trust. Second, due to lengthy delays in their activation of the required lighting reduction system, they've been polluting our night sky with dozens of blinking red lights for several years now. Third, by failing to timely include Nantucket in any new emergency response planning in the aftermath of the blade failure, They increase the likelihood that they will again be unprepared for disaster.
Greg Werkheiser is from the law firm Cultural Heritage Partners, who act as counsel for the town. He said the CBA was originally drawn up after the town wasn't given a seat at the table when federal government agencies were handing out licenses for offshore wind development.
The Community Benefit Agreement, or CBA, requires clear and proactive communications from Vineyard Wind about every stage of the project, from development to deployment to operations and maintenance. The company has repeatedly failed to fulfill the communications obligations of the CBA during times of both regular operations and, critically, during times of emergencies.
The town has listed 15 public demands of Vineyard Wind and say they will consider legal action if the developer doesn't agree to their requests. Nantucket's actions are being closely monitored by other states involved in offshore wind farm projects, as well as the industry itself. In the Day newspaper this week, a judge recently dismissed all criminal charges against former East Lyme Police Chief Michael Finkelstein, ending a year-long saga involving arrests and investigations that ultimately led to his retirement after 35 years in law enforcement. Middletown Superior Court Judge Elise L. Alfano signed off on the dismissal of 5 criminal charges from 3 separate arrests in June of 2024, all stemming from a state police investigation into alleged domestic violence incidents involving Finkelstein's wife. In September, Finkelstein was granted access into the Family Violence Education Program, a court diversionary program that involves mandated counseling and substance abuse treatments as deemed necessary. Finkelstein had been charged with violation of a protective order, making a false statement, second-degree breach of peace, and 2 counts of disorderly conduct. Finkelstein's successful completion of the program led to an administrative dismissal of the charges against him. However, the town has requested the Police Office Standards and Training Council, or POST, decertify Finkelstein as a police officer in the state. If that happens, Finkelstein will not be able to reapply for police officer status for 2 years. And the state has launched a new pizza license plate to help fight hunger in Connecticut and raise awareness of the state's title of pizza capital of the U.S. The new plates can be obtained through the non-profit Connecticut Food Share in collaboration with the DMV. Jason Jakubowski is the president and CEO of Connecticut Food Share and said food insecurity in the state is an issue.
The unfortunate reality is that even in a wealthy state like Connecticut, hunger is on the rise. 11% increase over the last year. There's about 515,000 Connecticut residents who don't know where their next meal is coming from, and it's all across the state of Connecticut. We serve all 169 towns. I can't tell you that there is one town that is less affected than the other.
Governor Lamont was at the launch event and expressed his concerns about how changes in federal policies were making it harder already for food banks like Connecticut Food Share and the people that rely on them.
35 trailer loads of food. I thought DOGE was getting rid of waste, fraud, and abuse. No, instead they're cutting out food deliveries to places like Food Share that provide hundreds of thousands of meals for folks who otherwise would not have a meal. And it's mean-spirited and wrong. And here in the state, we're trying to do everything we can to support. In our current budget, we got an additional $3 million and $6 million in the second year, trying to do what we can to help Food Share.
The new license plate can be obtained at ctfoodshare.org/pizza plate, with a standard plate costing $65 and a vanity version $134. That's all from us for this edition. Do send us your questions and story ideas to the show via our website at connecticut-east.com or Facebook or Twitter at Connecticut East and on Instagram at Connecticut East This Week. And you can listen to the show again on our social platforms, on demand, and by asking your smart speaker to play Connecticut East This Week podcast. And please like, follow, and share on your social media too. I'm Brian Scott Smith. Thank you for listening.